quite an amount of malt and barley gone in late. So in order for that to make malting spec, or to give it a chance to make malting spec, I don't think those farmers have an option but to reduce down their total amount of nitrogen, somewhat. You're probably, if they put it in old money, you're probably looking at somewhere in the region of 90 to 100 units of nitrogen at most, depending on when it was sown. Anything that was sown in May, you're probably looking at that kind of 90-ish sort of units per acre.
Fields sown to spring crops are now greening up, and most crops are looking really well. There is a number of critical actions which are needed in coming weeks to keep these crops on track. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Last week, we heard from Dr. Louise McNamara, who stressed the importance of applying an aphicide to control BYDV. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Shay, Phelan and Ciaran Collins, who are both tillage specialists in Teagasc, to discuss the management of spring crops. Ciaran, I just want to come to you first. Where are we now in terms of the amount of crops sown in the country?
The majority, I suppose, Michael. Unfortunately, there's still a bit to be sown. I suppose down my own side of the world, pretty much, all cereals are sown. There's a little bit of maize and beet to go in, and I'd say the next few fine days we'll look after that. However, just talking to colleagues in South Wexford and up in the northeast that maybe Shay'd be more familiar with, there still is some cereals to go in. I would say it's small, and obviously some forage crops as well. Just lads reporting from South Wexford now in particular, some of the tougher ground, it just took a long time to dry out. But look, overall, we're very, very high percentages. I mean, there probably isn't a huge amount to be sown, but just little pockets where there's bits left,
Okay, and I suppose there was a lot of talk about, it was getting terribly late, Ciaran, and people were talking about, I'm not going to plant anything now. So is there much ground, do you think, that's going to be left fallow?
I don't think so, to be honest. I suppose it's something that we talk about at times in terms of, is it feasible to do it and that? And that's, I suppose, another conversation. But overall, I think there's very, very little fallow ground when it'll come to it, Might be some, but not a huge amount.
Farmers just don't like leaving ground fallow, and that's fairly reasonable. And just in terms, Ciaran, of the area, spring area that's planted, how much of that area was planted in May, give or take?
It's hard to put a percentage on it. I suppose down south, you're talking about probably the 18th, 19th, 20th of April. You kind of got to start in those few days. And then the following week, started Monday the 22nd, there would have been a good bit, I'd say, sown down south in that week. And then I would say probably the further up the country you went, then you're pushing into the week starting the 29th and into early May. So I'd say there was a good bit of it done in the last days of April, to be fair. And those crops are looking quite well now, because like some of those crops are well into tillering already. It's unbelievable just to spurt the growth that's there, But there is a high proportion in May at the same time. But definitely I would say in the north, more so in the northern half of the country.
Okay. Shay, as Ciaran is talking about there, crops have got off to a good start. Are they looking as good all the way across the country?
Yeah, the later sown crops, if you like, Michael, and I agree with Ciaran, there was probably quite a bit of stuff up the north east of the country sown. I was up in the farm walk in Dublin last Friday, and there was quite a lot of guys still sowing at that stage on Friday. So I would say the vast majority of spring cereals, I'd say, were probably drilled up there probably from the 25th, 26th of April onwards. So I'd say the vast majority of them are grown are sown then. In terms of how they've emerged, to be fair, I mean, this weather's absolutely suit them ideally. Bit of heat last week, rain on Monday, rain again today. So they're actually growing on quite well. They're probably a lot better on than they would have been, say, this time last year when we started running into drought pressure. So they are growing well, to be fair to them. And I suppose what's key, is that the heat that was there in the ground, even though some of them might have had poor germination, everything has grown and everything has germinated. Unlike some of the earlier spring sown crops, which were sown in probably tougher conditions, they didn't establish as well and they didn't grow on as well. So some of those crops are actually quite thin. So the later sown ones seem to be a bit better, although they're way behind, in fairness,
Well, I suppose, Shay, we needed some little bit of a thing going for us. The rest of the, the last 6 or 8 months have been pretty tough. So
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the most part, we're in a scenario where crops are looking well. As Ciaran said, they're probably at heading on to very early tillering stage, and these crops are going to take a little bit of management now. So if we maybe just dive into that, maybe look at what we will assume that pretty much everybody has all of the P and K onto those crops and hopefully a little bit of nitrogen, maybe with some nitrogen remaining on some crops. Where do you think the nitrogen Shay should end up on some of these crops? Bearing in mind a lot of them are very late sown, and certainly a high proportion of them probably are going to or need to end up maybe in the malt and barley pile.
yeah. And it's a very difficult question to answer, Michael. I suppose first thing it will start off as rotation. So if you're in continuous cereals, obviously you can use the higher levels of nitrogen. But as you said, there's quite an amount of malt and barley gone in late. So in order for that to make malting spec or to give it a chance to make malting spec, I don't think those farmers have an option but to reduce down their total amount of nitrogen, somewhat. You're probably, if to put it in all money, you're probably looking at somewhere in the region of 90 to 100 units of nitrogen at most, depending on when it was sown. Anything that was sown in May, you're probably looking at that kind of 90-ish sort of units per acre. Um, and I suppose that's difficult to say because really what you're gambling on there is you're going to lose yield because you're using less nitrogen. But at the same time, I mean, when you look at the differential between malting barley and feed barley price, you're always probably better off to try and go for that malting if you have a contract and try and qualify for it, because like a 2 ton or a 2.2 ton crop of malting barley is going to pay you equally as well as a 3 or ton crop of feed barley. So I suppose that's where people kind of have to throw the kind of uh, throw the benchmark, if you like, in terms of trying to max out on those malt and barley crops. In terms of feed crops, whether it be feed barley, feed oats, probably you're going to try and hope for yield because at this stage your yield is probably limited. So you're probably looking at around 100 units or thereabouts. For spring wheat, again, you're probably looking at feed crops now at this stage, and you're probably looking at maybe 120, maybe 130 units at most on those crops as well. So, and certainly for the malt and barley and even for the feed barley, I mean, you need to get that nitrogen on early. You need to try and drive tiller growth to try and cover ground and get as many tillers and leaves and that lower canopy growing as much as you possibly can. So if you haven't got it on already, I would be inclined to get it on as soon as possible.
Okay, and Ciaran, with that in mind, in terms of nitrogen being a pretty big lever around lodging, there's some, let's just call them lesser known varieties that were imported this year, the likes of, I don't know, Freeway or Timor, or there's a whole heap of different ones out there.
Yep.
What would your assessment be of those in terms of a nitrogen regime?
Yeah, I suppose to go one step backwards, I suppose, look, we had a shortage of seed, and the seed trade obviously put in a big effort to get seed in, which was appreciated. I put them into three categories, the imported varieties. The first category are varieties that we're very familiar with, your Planet, your Laureates, varieties that ran the recommended list that we know, like for like, no great issue there. The second category of varieties then are varieties that were tested in Ireland and for some reason or other didn't make it onto the recommended list. It wouldn't always be to do with agronomic issues. It could be two varieties similar at the time. So we have quite a few of those. Saldo is one that springs to mind. It was on the recommended list back in, I think it was 16 or 17, so you have information there, Irish information. The third category is the one that you're really getting at there. These are the varieties that are imported, were never grown in Ireland, and we have little or no information on them. And the information that you get from a lot of this stuff came from Poland isn't really transferable because obviously climate's slightly different, but mainly they're grown in a different regime or they're tested in a different regime in terms of very low rates of nitrogen, and some even grown organically. So I think really, if you have one of those varieties, it's a case of getting out into it, walking it regularly, and not alone from a lodging perspective, but also from a disease perspective as well. You couldn't be in those crops often enough. The only observation I can make so far is that, to be fair, they've established really well. I think partly due to obviously good germinations, maybe compared to what we had here with our difficult harvest. Secondly, I think the 1,000 grain weights tended to be a little bit smaller. And obviously you got more plants. So, and look, as you say, that could lead to lodging too. The last one, Anna Michael, late planting. Lodging doesn't normally be an issue because, crops planted late, they tend to, well, normally, things dry up a bit and, we get shorter crops and less straw. But look, it is important to keep an eye on them at the same time, I think.
Sure. So Shay, going back then to some of the other management scenarios in spring crops, it's a very short, and it will be a very short phase between early tillering to the end of tillering to the flag leaf being there, if you know what I mean. Everything's going to be concertinaed in, if you like. So let's just talk about how do we fit everything in, especially maybe when a lot of those crops maybe, or certainly some of them anyway, probably aren't rolled even at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good point, Michael, because I'm looking at a huge variety of crops at the moment. I'm looking at crops that are sown in March, some are sown in early April, some sown in late April, and some sown in May. So if we take the ones sown in early March, just kind of give a perspective on it, they probably will be flag leaf out by the end of this month, okay? But the ones sown in late April, early May, they will probably have flag leaf out probably sometime toward the end of June. So there's a month there less of growing time, and we have to fit all the work into that period of time. So we're looking at probably an 8-week crop versus a 12-week crop, if you like. So if you take it that there's a lot of work to do in terms of, as you say, some of the later sown crops haven't even been rolled yet. So generally what people do is they wait for them to come up at this stage and let them get well established and well anchored in the ground. So you're talking probably, maybe early tillering and then go in and roll those, because quite often what you have, if you go too early, is especially on headlands, where you're twisting and turning on the headlands, you can actually pull plants out of the ground. So if we take that to start off with, that you have rolling to do, you're more than likely this year with the amount of barley under dwarf fires that we're seeing in winter barley, most of those crops will get an aphicide. You will have trace elements to do. You'll possibly even have maybe a PGR to do, which we might talk about later on. Obviously, you'll have weeds and wild oats to do. So there's a lot of work to do there in a very short space of time. And generally speaking, with spring barley, if you take spring barley predominantly, you're looking at maybe dividing those over maybe 3 and maybe in some cases 4 applications.
Shay, just interrupt you for a second, just to ask you, why am I worried if I'm after rolling or not? Why does that make a difference? 2
things, Michael. Well, there's 3 things really. Number one, if we're rolling now, there's quite a few reports of leather jacket damage out there at the moment. So that's number one, and slugs. Quite a bit of that damage out there. Number 2, we're also trying to conserve moisture and trying to keep moisture in those soils. Because we've seen before that where you don't roll those late sown crops in what are predominantly loose seed beds, they're at much more risk from drought than ones that are rolled and tightened down. So that's something I think that we've seen in previous years where we really, really need to make sure those seed beds are as tight as possible, if you like. And already I'm starting to see manganese deficiency in some of those looser seed beds. So that's something whereby rolling, early can help to alleviate that. So it's something that we kind of tend to forget about sometimes, but certainly it's something that we need to be looking at.
I suppose I just was thinking in terms of, if I rolled it, why is that going to interrupt the next ththings that I'm going to do? Crop damage, I suppose.
I was just going to come to that. And I suppose that's something we have to be aware of, that where you do go in and you roll that crop, you need that puts the crop under stress. So you need to leave it probably 7 to 10 days before you come back and do anything else with it. So that's the starting point of it, right?
Okay, so we're fitting in an insecticide, a trace element, a herbicide, wild oat spray, potentially disease spray, maybe potentially.
Yeah.
Do they all go into one tank, Shay?
No, I suppose is the obvious answer, Michael. And again, it's probably field specific, and crop specific. So if we break it down into kind of little bits and pieces, what's the most urgent? Obviously, a barley yellow dwarf virus is most urgent at the moment. So BYDV at that kind of early 2 to 3 leaf stage.
And I suppose that's at the early tillering 40 stage now, is it?
40 stage, yeah.
Okay.
So I suppose what we need to look at then is what can we put in with that and what's going to be timely with that. To me, and in my opinion, look at the crops I'm looking at the moment, and as I say, every field is different. Certainly trace elements fit into that application as well, all right? And And again, I mean, you can look at if there's a PGR needed on some of those crops. Some of them are a little bit thin, mightn't have got the establishment that you like. Maybe that can go in there as well. If not, I'd probably be looking at weed control and trying to get my weeds under control as early as I possibly can. So that'd be my first application, if you like, in terms of what I'm trying to control.
Ciaran, would you agree? Would you throw in a wild oat spray in there maybe? Or
The crops I'm seeing, I suppose, look, virus is obviously going to be a big target. There's no problem finding aphids in crops, even after rain the other day, you can see them. And I think the other thing is there's a lovely little flush of soft, actively growing weeds in those crops that are, say, at that 4-leaf stage or maybe even a little bit beyond it. Absolutely brilliant time to get at them, I think, So yeah, your insecticide, I think your weed control can be done at that stage as well in those crops. And also I think we should consider wild oats at that stage as well, because you mentioned all the things that have to be done, like and fungicide will creep up on us very, very quickly. It's short growing season, as Shay mentioned there. And ideally, if you're using the likes of Axial, you need that 3 weeks between, your weed spray and your wild oat herbicide. So maybe if there's a good flush of weeds there, get the wild oats done now as well.
So 2 things to ask in that, I suppose people will be I suppose concerned about. They're going up to their sprayer, they're opening up the hopper and they're saying, oh geez, right, I'm spilling in an SU in here, I'm spilling in an insecticide in here, I'm putting in like the Galaxy or one of the hormone sprays in here, and I'm also tipping in some wild oat control. Is that going to be 2 questions? One, is it going to be hard on crops? And 2, the concern probably would be around wild oats. Are they all going to be up?
Yeah, look, that's the obvious one, I suppose, with wild oats that we're concerned with. Is in terms of compatibility in actively growing crops, that type of mix is generally fine. Trace elements can sometimes maybe heat it up a little bit if you have a lot of that in it. I think really it's a very legitimate question in terms of, is it too early for wild oat herbicide? Look, if the crop is at that 4-leaf stage or a little bit beyond it, I think you'll probably be okay. Like the wild oats will germinate slightly behind the main crop. We always find that. I suppose the one area that I would be a little bit concerned in there that you would be using the wild oat herbicide for is the canary grass. We're seeing, especially where canary grass is bad, we get this staggered germination, that you get a flush and maybe a second run of it after. In that scenario, I think I would be really cautious and maybe leaving that maybe to go in with the fungicide, But I think, we've got a good flush of weeds. Remember, like we've good soil temperatures, we've had moisture, I think we're primed really to get a good hit on weeds early,
Okay. And Shay, just in terms of, and you mentioned it already, a number of these crops have a trace element potentially deficiency. I think you mentioned manganese, but magnesium can also be a problem in a really rapidly growthy kind of period. What would your advice be to a farmer if they went out to the field, nothing's done so far, seen a couple of those problems out in the field? Does he just throw that into all the other mixes, or is there a different way of going about it?
Yeah, Michael, I suppose you have to look at what stress the crop is under. So if there's a lot of stress in the crop, I think what I would be inclined to do is trying to alleviate that stress as much as I possibly could. So like Ciaran was saying, yes, you can. If you look at the label recommendations, you can certainly mix hormones or certainly mix weed sprays, wild oat sprays, an insecticide and all those. But if I see a crop under stress, I try to treat that first. And generally speaking, if you have a very bad magnesium deficiency or a very bad manganese deficiency, they don't really react too well to having a whole heap of other stuff thrown on top of them as well. So in that case, what I would try and do is after, say, if it's been rolled or something like that, then I go in and treat my virus treatment, my trace elements. Then I'd probably leave it 3, 4, 5 days to try and let that work into the system. Then I come back in with my herbicides to try and solve that problem. And I suppose the other thing that we kind of have to be aware of too, and maybe Ciaran might come back in on this as well, in terms of mixing that wild oats and going early with that wild oat herbicide. In these late sown crops, if we go with a weed spray on its own first, you have to kind of, or it's recommended that you wait 3 weeks to come back in with a wild oat herbicide afterwards. If we wait 3 weeks for wild oat herbicide afterwards, to try and match that in with a fungicide spray, the chances are we're going to be too late for the first fungicide spray. So none of these mixes or sequences are going to be ideal. So I think what really people have to do is have to look and see what's in their own crops first, or what's in the field, each individual field, and make a decision based on what they see in front of them.
Yeah, if I could come in there, Michael, I'd say like what Shay is saying there is what we normally did in 3 passes in a short growing season, you're trying to do in 2 passes really. And I suppose you're trying to try to pick the best scenario that suits the crop that's in front of you. You know, like as I said earlier, if you have a canary grass issue, you're going to switch that herbicide back maybe to the fungicide. You know, if you've got a good flush of weeds, maybe the crop that's maybe into start to tillering, you know, you're going back the other way. I think that's really it's a sort of try and get the best fit for the field that you're in, really, you know. And it's, again, I couldn't agree more about if there is trace element deficiencies or anything like that, that's number one. They all have to be sorted before you can put anything else on the crop, really, or you'll do more damage, you know.
So, Ciaran, as you were saying, there's 3 different applications there. We'll start from kind of the end and work our way back. So the final fungicide is when the awns are peeping, and then you bring it back. Then you have your first fungicide, which is somewhere around kind of late tillering. That's going to happen relatively quickly, I suppose, this year. But I suppose maybe the first question around disease, I presume there's no great disease out there at the moment, or is there?
No, look, so far crops are relatively clean as you'd expect. Now, Planet is the one crop that we've seen a lot of net blotching, even at the 2-leaf stage, you know. So again, it kind of goes back to what we've said earlier on. You kind of have to play the ball in front of you. And we do have quite a few scenarios. Planet has grown for malting. So you have the same growers blowing Planet this year as grew it last year. You also then obviously had the autumn that we've had. So there was less winter crop sown. There's more spring barley. So I think those scenarios are rising quite a bit. Down my side of the world, you wouldn't have to travel too far to find a field with net blotch in it. So, you know, that's something, again, that changes the puck out, because we talk about getting that first fungicide on at maybe late tillering, early stem extension. If you've got a lot of net blotch in the crop, you have to bring that forward. You have to get in there at early mid tillering, because remember, yield comes from tillers. We've less time for the crop to develop those tillers in a late sowing situation, so we need to mind them and protect them. So that all of a sudden becomes a priority in that crop if there's net blotch in there. So you kind of have to work other things around it maybe a little bit, you know. That might include a herbicide going with a fungicide, you know. That's just the way it might turn out in some of those cases.
Okay, so as Shay was saying there, you really need to keep your eye on a crop by crop basis, and you might have some crops that are following, you know, spring barley, and they're probably at more risk of disease versus something that might be coming in after a wheat or beans or something or else. Speaking of which, Shay, and I'll give the final word to you because time is after passing by very fast. Shay, just want to change it just a little bit and maybe talk about beans. Not all beans are up as yet, but most of them are, I think. Is there anything to look out for there that people should be looking at? I mean, look, we're probably in a scenario where, you know, best will in the world, beans aren't going to do their average yield this year. They're probably going to be a good bit lower. So people will be keeping their eye very much on costs.
Yeah, and it's a conundrum, Michael, because I mean, beans being a good break crop, they do bring a lot of benefits to the rotation. And looking at crops that I've seen that are up in the last couple of weeks and some of the farm walks that have been, there's already quite a bit of bean weevil damage on those crops. So that's where I would be starting. And albeit, as you say, no doubt there will be some crops that will get very little looking after or minding just because people want to claim the payment and spend very little on them. To me, I think you have to give them any chance that they can possibly give to give you something. So I would be starting if there's a lot of bean weevil damage and evidence of a lot of bean weevil damage, I think I would be going and treating that first and foremost.
The damage, explain what that looks like?
So bean weevil damage, generally on leaves, you'll see bite marks out of the outside of the leaves, and they're generally on all the leaves. So if you see a lot of bite marks around the edges of all the leaves on the bean plant, I think I will be going with an insecticide there on those.
And do we have a threshold on that, Shay?
So look at it, if every plant you're seeing bite marks on every plant, or most plants, I would be inclined to go, or most leaves, I'd be inclined to go and do it. After that, I suppose, I mean, most crops will have got some sort of weed control, and I think that's paramount, and most of it would have been pre-emmed. The one thing that I do see in crops in previous years like this is people forget about grass weed control. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of, that if there are, say, bad wild oats or sterile brome or something like that, beans are an ideal opportunity to get that under control. So that would be number two. And I suppose finally then you're looking at the disease control. And generally speaking, some of those later sown crops don't tend to get chocolate spot as bad, but I still think I would be treating it and keeping an eye out for chocolate spot in around flowering and control it then.
Yeah, just one reminder, it's probably no harm mentioning it, Michael, like, to claim the protein payment, crops must be grown to a commercial stand with an attempt to harvest, so I think it's worth managing them. Look, certainly with disease control, in a late season, if we get dry weather, the input there might be very little, but, I think it is important that they're grown to a commercial stand, and that could be something. Do you want to get any people to lose out on the protein payment,
Guys, thanks very much for that. The final word maybe from both of you. You're in the middle of your Teagasc spring crop walks at the moment. You've been around to a good bit of the country, Shay. I think you mentioned it already. There's ones lined up for mine in Cork, Donegal, Kerry, Offaly, Kilkenny, and Bandon in Cork over the next 7 days or so. How are they going, or what's the reaction from farmers? What's the big thing farmers should turn up to listen to?
Certainly, so far, Michael, I've had a number of them so far, and yes, you're right. There's plenty of things to be looking at on crops, like what we've discussed about today in terms of spring crops. There's a variety of issues ongoing in spring crops, and we're seeing different issues across the country. So they're no harm to talk about. The other thing that I've had at a couple of meetings, which are interesting as well, is just this whole area of grass weeds and how do we control grass weeds, because the next month or 6 weeks are key in controlling problem grass weeds like blackgrass, like Italian ryegrass. So all those type of things are certainly coming up in the ones that I've been attending so far.
Yeah, for me, it's spring barley, unfortunately. Look, it's just the season that we have. It's all about virus. It's all about disease control. It's about some of the stuff we spoke about there, getting the, what do we put in the tank at the specific time and getting those timings matched up, I think, really. But spring barley is the dominant one, obviously, yeah.
But would it be fair to say, lads, look, I suppose at these crop walks, there is, there's a lot of farmers turning up. What we do know is that, crops aren't going to yield as well as we would like, given the year that's in it. So margins are going to be under pressure, and I suppose having an independent view about the inputs that farmers are going to put on from now until the end of the season is probably really worthwhile for farmers to turn up to our walks. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely,
no, look, there's a range of everything is covered, I suppose, really, However, some of those crops sown, the barley sown there at the back end of April, I wouldn't rule out good yields in them yet now.
On that optimistic note, we better stop there. Thanks very much, Ciaran. No, I'm delighted, and you should say there are crops are looking well so far, and the bit of rain that we got, I think, is really going to kind of spur them on, and hopefully they will turn into really good crops. Guys, as always, a huge amount of information there. Thanks very much for coming, and we'll be chatting to you again shortly.
Thank you.
No problem, Michael.
So that's it for the show this week. My thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me. As I mentioned, keep an eye out for the Teagasc Spring crop walks in your area. These walks will deal with the management of late sown crops and how to get the best from them throughout the year. In the coming week, we will hold the final walks of the series in Fermoy, Cork, Donegal, Kerry, Offaly, Kilkenny, and finally in Bandon in Cork. Please come along and listen to the advice from both Shay and Ciaran. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.